On this Sunday night, tragedy strikes a popular festival. Burning Man takes a deadly turn as severe weather converts the desert into a mud pit, stranding thousands of revelers.
A lot of people have run out of food and water.
What they're being urged to do. A typhoon tears through Taiwan. The violent wind, torrential rain, and where the storm's barreling now. New provincial policies on preferred pronouns, the fears they could jeopardize student safety. And Canadian men can jump. The hoop dreams coming true for the national men's basketball team.
Global National with Farah Nasser. Reporting tonight, Nitu Garcha.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. What was supposed to be a 9-day event full of self-expression and art has turned into a nightmare in Nevada. Tens of thousands of people at the Burning Man Festival are stranded tonight after 2 to 3 months worth of rain fell in just 24 hours, swamping what's normally a desert. Redmond Shannon explains what campers are being told to do and how they're coping.
Burning Man normally takes place under the burning Nevada sun.
Ooh, it feels like a mud bath.
Not this year. Torrential rain over the past 2 days has turned it into a swamp. Police say one person has died, although the circumstances are unclear. They are also telling the tens of thousands of festival goers to stay put and to not try to drive through the mud.
I heard the rangers, if they catch you, will stop you from driving on it because it just makes matters worse at times.
Organisers are asking everyone to conserve water and food too.
We might be here till Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday next week. It just depends, and we don't even know. A lot of people have run out of food and water, and some people are stealing things because that's what happens when things get weird. There's a little bit of this like Lord of the Flies vibe.
However, it appears most festival goers are embracing Burning Man's ethos of community and self-reliance. The event has taken place in Nevada's Black Rock Desert since 1990.
A bunch of really nice people that are sharing what they have. Our camp brings out supplies, and we have kind of a makeshift kitchen where we prepare 2 meals a day.
Some have made it out, including US DJ Diplo and comedian Chris Rock.
Everything is left behind but this. I have my boots. That's all I have right now.
Las Vegas man Manny Kess also managed to get out on Saturday, despite local officials urging people to shelter in place.
I understand it's federal land. They can stop you from entering, but legally they cannot stop you from leaving.
With more rain on Sunday, it's unclear if many more people will be able to get out once the festival wraps on Monday. Redmond Shannon, Global News.
And still in Nevada, thunderstorms have swamped Sin City with heavy rain and flooding. Cars drove through roads that looked more like rivers. Even the famous Las Vegas Strip was flooded. One person has died. Officials believe the person drowned. The storm has moved on and sunny, dry weather is in the forecast. A typhoon is set to crash into southeastern China and Hong Kong, leaving more than 130 million people on alert tonight. The powerful storm has already hammered Taiwan. As Mackenzie Gray explains, it's the biggest storm to hit that island since 2019.
Barreling into Taiwan, Typhoon Haikui leaving a trail of destruction. More than 40 people injured and nearly 120,000 without power as the storm lashed the eastern part of the island. Flights and trains were canceled, with planes in Taipei needing to be tied down to avoid being blown away by the 155-kilometer-per-hour winds. The Taiwanese president urging people to stay home to avoid the worst storm to hit the island in 4 years. The weather should improve in 2 days, allowing the focus to shift to cleaning up. The situation many in Florida are in right now, after Hurricane Idalia slammed the state last week.
It was really windy and the water got really high, but I mean, it wasn't terrible. I lost power and water, but I'm still here.
The extensive damage ruining many homes and businesses, leaving some unsure how they'll rebuild.
There's no flood insurance on any of these low-lying buildings, so only anything caused damage by water they won't cover.
A situation many others will likely face in the future, as increased ocean temperatures from climate change will allow for stronger storms.
I think what we're starting to see is another clear climate signal is the frequency in which storms can undergo rapid intensification.
Idalia has now moved back out over water, joining a tropical traffic jam in the central Atlantic Ocean, where there are now 4 named storms with the potential to cause more damage. But right now, Neetu, none are forecasted to hit Canada or the U.S.
All right, Mackenzie Gray in Ottawa. Thanks, Mackenzie. Stormy weather is being embraced in Hay River, Northwest Territories, where steady rainfall is keeping a nearby wildfire at bay. Favorable winds and lower temperatures are also helping, but the fire is still raging just a half-kilometer away from the town. Emergency crews managed to keep the fire from reaching the only highway into the community. About 463,000 hectares of land have been scorched so far. Climate activists have long urged large corporations to prioritize being green over greed. Now environmentalists are increasingly taking aim at the people leading those companies and what they do outside of the office. And Gaviola explains the enormous effect the ultra-wealthy has on the planet and what critics are calling for.
Environmental activists have long had big corporations in their crosshairs, but increasingly they're targeting the 1%.
I do think the ultra-wealthy lifestyles and the amount of carbon they burn is over the top and irresponsible and unacceptable.
Private jets and super yachts, symbols of the unsustainable lifestyles of the rich and famous. The backlash comes with growing evidence that billionaires are bad for the planet, fueling frustration that although the pandemic dealt a major financial blow to the lowest income households, the rich got richer. Of the $57 trillion in new wealth generated since the pandemic, $35 trillion, or about 2/3, has been accumulated by the world's richest 1%. And the 125 richest billionaires each emit more than 1 million times more carbon than the average person in the bottom 90%, according to research by Oxfam. Wealthier countries and individuals have a greater ability to shield themselves from or deal with the devastation of climate change, a luxury developing nations and marginalized communities can't afford. Case in point, last year's historic flooding in Pakistan hit children and women in the poorest regions the hardest.
Women who were fleeing the flooding in Pakistan, which was linked to the climate emergency, led to a crisis in maternal care.
Environmentalists are advocating for a higher price on pollution as well as a global wealth tax.
We also call for a tax or an outright ban on the planet-wrecking luxuries of the super rich.
Tax collected from those with money to burn could be used to fight or mitigate the impact of pollution and increasingly frequent and intense natural disasters. Still, some warn that focusing on the ultra-wealthy shouldn't absolve everyone else of personal responsibility.
When you start adding up all of the SUVs and all of the number of trips to store and back where you could just as easily walk it or take public transport, the fact is we're doing way more damage than they are with their private jets.
Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
New Brunswick has one. Now Saskatchewan has a policy on gender pronouns in schools. If a child or teen under 16 wants to change their preferred name or pronoun, they'll need their parents' permission. An LGBTQ2+ group in Regina calls that unconstitutional and is taking legal action against the province. As Taria Isri reports, advocates worry rules like this will put students in danger.
Students across Canada are returning to the classroom, but there are new and polarizing policies at schools in New Brunswick and Saskatchewan, setting off protests and fears for trans students.
When we think about the reasons that kids might not want to tell their parents or be comfortable with that being disclosed to their parents, it's often because they don't have a supportive family at home.
In Saskatchewan, any student under 16 who wants to identify by a different name or pronoun now needs parental consent.
We have the opportunity to look at a policy that is going to bring families closer together in this respect, in their education. We need to look at that and look at that seriously, and you're seeing other governments across the nation do the same.
New Brunswick's Conservative Premier Blaine Higgs was the first to introduce similar legislation, while other provinces like Manitoba and Ontario are not ruling it out.
Parents, must be fully involved and fully aware of what's happening in the life of their children.
But trans people say they're being used to score political points, and that these types of policies will only endanger teenagers by outing them.
I have some really wonderful library volunteers helping me out.
Tara Sipniewski founded the Trans Library in Ottawa last year.
I grew up in a very transphobic time, right? And I knew who I was at 14. I knew exactly who I was at that age.
Most of the visitors who walk through her doors are teenagers.
We like to keep these because it's like a history of where we've been.
She worries pronoun policies will alienate students who are already vulnerable. A recent report from the University of Ottawa found trans adolescents are 5 times more likely to be suicidal. But that risk goes down by 25% when their preferred pronouns and identities are used, according to a study from US-based charity, the Trevor Project.
They're working it out. You know, they're definitely working it out, and they need help working it out sometimes.
Sipniewski believes school should be a safe place to work it out, when home is not. Taria Isri, Global News, Ottawa.
Ready, Set, Campaign. Coming up, why Manitoba's election could be historic. Plus, the BC Catering Company serving up a delicious world record. As Russia's war drags on, there has been a major shakeup in the Ukrainian government. President Volodymyr Zelensky has replaced his defense minister. After heading the ministry for more than 550 days of full-scale war, Oleksiy Reznikov has been replaced with Rustem Umerov. Zelensky says the ministry needs new approaches and other formats of interaction with both the military and society. In Manitoba, the one-month countdown has begun to the provincial election. While the writ doesn't drop until Tuesday, party leaders have been unofficially campaigning for weeks. The incumbent Premier Heather Stefanson will try to win a third government for the Progressive Conservatives. She faces stiff competition from the NDP's Wab Kinew. Our chief political correspondent David Akins will be tracking this. And David, this race could be historic.
Indeed. Heather Stefanson became Premier of Manitoba when she won her party's leadership contest in the fall of 2021. And now she is trying to become the first woman in Manitoba's history to lead her party to a win in a general election. Her chief opponent is New Democrat Wab Kinew. If Kinew wins, he will become the first First Nations person to become a premier anywhere in Canada. Heather Stefanson's Progressive Conservatives have been behind in the polls for most of her time as Premier, but that gap narrowed in the last 3 months.
Heather Stefanson, since coming into office, has been very clear that she is supportive of the so-called Freedom Convoy, the anti-vax movement, and is very willing to stoke divisive language when it comes to Ottawa and Justin Trudeau.
I hear about Wab Kinew every day.
The vote is on October the 3rd, but campaigning has been underway since late spring. Both the PCs and the NDP expect tough fights in Winnipeg, but also in smaller centres like Brandon and Dauphin.
It's almost block by block. It's almost going to be neighborhood by neighborhood, 300, 500 votes difference in 10 different ridings. I think that's how tight this might be.
This is Kinew's second election as leader of the NDP, and while the PCs under former Premier Brian Pallister won a majority 4 years ago, Kinew was credited with turning around NDP fortunes and picking up 8 seats.
The NDP's been very specific in positing Wab as not a First Nations premier, but a premier for all. And of course, if you know Canadian politics, no Indigenous person is going to win solely catering to Indigenous interests.
Stefanson will be trying to follow Pallister's back-to-back majority wins with one of her own.
The issues that matter to all Canadians are kind of just writ large at the core of this campaign. It's healthcare post-COVID, it's cost of living, it's crime and safety, which is quite a surprisingly big issue in Winnipeg.
Crime has gotten out of control. It's related, of course, with poverty.
David, what are the key battlegrounds you'll be watching?
Well, let's look at how things turned out 4 years ago in 2019. The NDP won the handful of ridings in the north of the province, and you can see the PC blue was dominant pretty much everywhere else. But then we take a look at Winnipeg. Downtown, like most urban cores in Canada, progressive parties dominate, NDP and Liberals. Then, as we move out to the suburbs and into the rural areas of the province, well, that's where the PCs are. Here's the big wild card, I think, in this race. How are those who voted Liberal and Green 4 years ago going to vote this time? Let me demonstrate. This riding right here is called McPhillips. It's north of Winnipeg, McPhillips riding. And 4 years ago, this was the closest race in the province. The PC candidate won by 88 votes. 88 votes. But the Liberals got 1,500 votes. The Greens got 400 votes. Now, if those Green voters and Liberal voters from 4 years ago swing to either of these parties, well, that, of course, could affect the outcome in McPhillips. But there are dozens of ridings like McPhillips in Winnipeg. And that's why Liberal and Green voters this time around, well, they could determine the overall election winner. Neither.
All right, David Aiken in Ottawa. Thanks, David. 25 years since the Swiss Air disaster. Ahead, I'll speak with a former Navy commander tasked with recovering remains.
25 years later, we gather here at the edge of the sea to mark this difficult milestone in the spirit of remembrance, recognition, and healing.
This ceremony in Nova Scotia marks 25 years since the deadly crash of Swiss Air Flight 111. The passenger jet plunged into the frigid waters off Peggy's Cove on September 2nd, 1998, during a flight from New York to Switzerland, killing all 229 people on board. Greg Akins is the former commander of a Canadian Navy vessel that was tasked with recovering debris and remains. Greg, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Nita.
So can you tell us more about your work in the recovery mission and how did it affect you personally?
Sure. So we sailed, and when it became apparent that it was no longer a rescue, it was strictly a search and recovery. And I was assigned as the on-scene commander for a very large operation that established a big exclusion zone because it was still a criminal investigation. The aircraft had, valuables, money, gems, etc. on it. And we didn't know the extent of the debris field yet. And so it was a very large exclusion zone that we had to monitor and maintain, so to keep people out. So we had aircraft, boats, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, RCMP, and doing that. And then finding the flight recorder was job one because it has a very limited time that the transponder works. And actually one of our submarines first found a boat where it was, and then our divers recovered it just as it was running out of battery, in actually a pretty heroic effort because they were also running out of air. So we brought the black box. Of course, it's not black at all. It's surprising when it came on board. It's orange, and so that was a very important part of it. And then from there, it was recovering the human remains and aircraft parts as much as we could with the Canadian. And of course, the American divers came up. I had a very large American salvage ship, the USS Grapple, working for me as well. So we would recover the human parts. Our ship was the at-sea morgue, and we process all the human remains there and then take them ashore with our helicopter to Shearwater where they were further processed.
Wow. And I understand it was just months after you had become the fleet's youngest commander that you were ordered to lead what would eventually become Canada's largest peacetime marine operation. What do you remember about the moment you got that order?
It's kind of hard to understand, what you're going into, an airplane crash, and what does that mean, and sure that there was a lot of moving pieces, of great complexity, because of course the search part of it, we have a number of ships mapping in detail with these very sensitive sonars, the sea floor, to look for any parts of the aircraft, and it was a much larger operation than I would have imagined. And of course, it took a long time. We were out there for over 3 weeks for our part, and luckily, through the effort of everybody involved, by the time our task ended, we had recovered remains from every single person who was identified on that flight. So we really felt good about that, hoping that would bring some closure to the families.
I'm sure it did. How did your role in the mission shape your career and your life?
So it was without any doubt the most challenging mission I had ever undertook as a captain of a ship, and after that as well, just in terms of not just the magnitude and complexity, but also just a huge leadership challenge because of what we were facing, and we had really no concept of what PTSD was, had no experience with it. This is a long time before Afghanistan, of course, the war there. And so when I started to have sailors who were deeply affected at sea, I would be compassionate and let them go ashore. I think it happened to 2 of them out there, but I didn't really understand. These were people I had tremendous respect for, I knew well, and yet they couldn't carry on with their duties as sailors at sea. And so that was the first indication that this was not a normal operation. And of course, there was lasting impacts after that. I imagine the divers, especially because they had the most gruesome task, but also the people on our ship who were, processing the remains and stuff. It was a very, very challenging time psychologically. Personally, I didn't know that it had impacted me so severely until years later. I was just having increasing psychological challenges I just didn't understand as PTSD, and then finally, it came to the point where it was affecting me severely with flashbacks, anxiety, and depression. That I went and sought help. And luckily, the Navy was able to provide me with good resources to help. And I'm also fortunately a Christian, so my faith helped enormously in that healing process afterwards.
Wow. 25 years on, how are you marking this day?
So it's been a lot of prayer yesterday and today, just for the families and the divers, again, in particular, who just had a day in, day out, a horrific task that they did incredibly well. And selflessly.
That is retired Navy Commander Greg Akins. Greg, for everything you have carried since your service, for your service itself, and for joining us today, thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.
Game-changing win. Next, the Canadian men's basketball team scores a ticket to the Olympics. It is one of the biggest days in Canadian sporting history. Canada has stunned Spain, the world's #1 basketball team, to move on to the next round of the FIBA World Cup. More importantly, the men punched their ticket to next summer's Paris Olympics. Eric Sorensen explains how it all unfolded.
It was win or go home for Canada. And it looked like the men's team was going to let another big moment slip away when Spain surged to a 12-point lead after 3 quarters. But this time would be different. Canada mounted a furious comeback. Clutch shots from Dylan Brooks, who brought a toughness to this team. And Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who's emerged as one of the true superstars in the world of basketball. And before you knew it, Canada had knocked off the defending World Cup champions.
It was a lot of adversity. Hats off to them. But I think our group just wanted a little bit more. We knew it was at stake, and we were willing to do whatever it took.
The win not only puts Canada into the World Cup quarterfinals, but with losses by Brazil and others, this country has now qualified for the Olympics next year.
We want to make sure that everybody knows that we're knocking at the door and that we're thirsty for more.
The Canadian team last made the Olympics with Steve Nash in 2000. That and a new era of pro basketball in this country with Vince Carter and the Toronto Raptors inspired a new generation that is finally delivering on the promise they've shown.
They did it. They're going to the Olympics. It's phenomenal. It feels as though it's the first step of really an era of the men's program and Canada basketball being one of the best in the world.
Gilgeous-Alexander's mother went to the Olympics in track and field. For him, it feels pretty special.
She holds no more bragging rights, and I know the best athletes in the world are there, and we consider ourselves amongst that group, and it's a good feeling to go.
But first, the Canadians will play Luka Doncic and Slovenia in the World Cup quarterfinals on Wednesday. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
And that's Global National for this Sunday. Tonight's Your Canada may make you hungry.
A new Guinness World Records title has been achieved for the longest charcuterie board.
Sheila's Catering Company pulled off this enormous feat in White Rock, BC. The board, full of cured meat, fruit, and cheese, kept chilled with ice blankets, spans 148 meters, crushing the old record of 62 meters. A falconer was even there to help keep seagulls away. Thanks so much for watching, and see you tomorrow. Have a great night.